does betrayal truly break a person, or does it awaken them? Eleanor ignored the signs, trusted the wrong man, and paid the price at her lowest point. But pain has a purpose. As manipulation turns into exposure, she begins to reclaim control, not through emotion, but strategy. The lesson
These
is clear.
documents confirm the
Awareness is
timeline we
power,
suspected.
and denial is the
And
real
this
danger.
evidence folder highlights
If
the
this
key
perspective made you think
discrepancies.
deeper, like and share to
You don't
support
understand the
channel.
gravity
Thanks
of
for
this
watching.
situation.
The crystal
If you don't
flute
accept the
shattered on the
terms, we will
marble
be
floor,
forced to litigate.
but Caroline heard nothing. Her eyes were fixed on her
Trading has
husband's
been
hand
halted
as it
across the
rested
major
on another
exchanges
woman's
as
stomach.
the sell-off
He was
accelerates.
drawing slow,
This is the
tender
worst thing-
circles with his thumb, the same way he once touched her. There she stood, 8 months pregnant with his child, in a room filled with 500 guests. She watched as her billionaire husband whispered into his mistress's ear. Then a devastating realization struck her. Vivian was not just his lover, she was also carrying his child. What happened next would dismantle a billion-dollar empire. But Preston Ashworth was completely unaware of one critical fact. For the past 3 months, his wife had not been weeping. She had been building a case against him. She gathered evidence, recorded their conversations, and documented every single one of his lies. The woman he dismissed as hormonal and unstable was about to orchestrate his downfall. She left that party quietly. There was no screaming, no confrontation, and no warning. By the following morning, Preston Ashworth would discover he had lost everything. He lost his corporation, his family fortune, his reputation, and his freedom. This is the story of how one woman's silence became the most devastating weapon of all. This story offers a profound lesson. It demonstrates that being quiet is not a sign of weakness. Sometimes, the most silent people are preparing the biggest comeback. Your worth is not determined by how someone else treats you. Your worth is defined by how you respond when they underestimate you completely. This story has an even deeper resonance. Every woman who has ever felt invisible in her own marriage will see herself in Caroline. Every person who has been manipulated and made to feel crazy for trusting their instincts will find their feelings validated here. This story is proof that you are never too broken to heal yourself. You are never too lost to find your way back. And in the end, your voice is never too quiet to make a difference. True victory is not about revenge. It is about reclaiming yourself. The champagne glass slipped from Caroline's grasp the moment she saw her husband's hand on Vivian Marlowe's pregnant belly. The crystal exploded against the gleaming marble. The noise cut through the string quartet's melody, a sound as sharp and sudden as a scream. 500 pairs of eyes turned toward the sound. But Caroline did not notice the stares. Her entire universe had shrunk to the other side of the Ashworth Foundation's annual charity gala. Her attention was locked on Preston, on his hand, and on the body of that other woman. The Metropolitan Ballroom was a spectacle of wealth, with chandeliers worth $10 million dripping light from the ceiling. Women in priceless designer gowns floated between tables draped in white silk. Servers glided silently with silver platters of appetizers that cost more than most people's monthly rent. It was the most important social event of the year. And Caroline's husband was lovingly caressing another woman's pregnancy. She counted in her head, 1, 2, 3 seconds of contact. His thumb traced a slow, deliberate circle. Vivian let out a little laugh at something he whispered to her. Caroline knew that laugh. It was the one Preston used when he was being charming, when he was being his most authentic self. He had not laughed with her that way in months. A waiter instantly appeared at her feet. He swept up the broken glass with a swift, efficient movement. He did not make eye contact with her. Nobody did. The guests had already turned away. They were back to their own worlds, having already dismissed the pregnant wife who had dropped her glass. Caroline's designer silk gown felt tight across her swollen belly. She was 8 months along, carrying the child of Preston Ashworth for 32 weeks. She placed a protective hand over the curve of her stomach. The baby kicked sharply, as if it sensed that something was deeply wrong. She pulled out her phone, unlocked it, and simply stared at the blank screen. She pressed the lock button, then unlocked it again. What was she supposed to do? Send him a text, call his phone, march over and demand to know why his hand was on his director of special projects, like she belonged to him? She locked the phone. Nothing on that device could fix this. Then, Eleanor Ashworth materialized at her side. Preston's mother moved through the crowd like a shark gliding through water, silent and dangerous. Her fingers dug into Caroline's arm with enough force to leave a bruise. "Smile, dear," Eleanor instructed. Her voice was like smooth honey mixed with tiny shards of glass. "People are watching you." "Did you see that?" Caroline whispered, her voice trembling. "I saw you create a scene by dropping your glass." Preston, with Vivian. His hand was on her stomach. Eleanor's grip tightened, but her perfectly painted smile did not waver. "Whatever you think you saw, you are mistaken. Ashworth women do not cause a scene. Ashworth women never make accusations. Ashworth women smile and wave and behave as if their world is perfect." "But I know what I saw." Eleanor released her arm. Her smile grew colder. "You saw nothing. Now, go to the powder room, fix your face, and when you come back, you will act like the loving wife of Preston Ashworth III. You will be the woman carrying this family's future heir. You will not embarrass me again." With that, Eleanor drifted away. She joined a circle of wealthy donors near the silent auction tables. Within moments, she was laughing at someone's joke. She was the ideal hostess, the ideal high society wife, and the ideal monster. Carolyn made her way through the ballroom feeling completely invisible. She walked past Preston's business associates, who offered her brief, polite nods. She walked past the wives of his board members, who blew meaningless air kisses in her direction. She walked past the mayor and his wife, the governor and his girlfriend, and a senator whose name she could not remember. Not a single one of them truly saw her. She was just an accessory. She was Preston's pregnant wife, a simple prop in the elaborate production of his perfect life. Then she saw Rachel near the bar. Rachel Whitmore was her best friend from college. She was the only person in this entire room who actually cared about her. Rachel was sipping a whiskey. Her fiery red hair was pulled back into a sophisticated bun. The emerald green dress she was wearing was one she had borrowed from Caroline's closet. She looked up as Caroline approached. "Carrie, you look like you have just seen a ghost." Rachel paused. Her eyes narrowed with concern. "What is wrong?" "I need to leave." "What happened?" "I need to leave right now, Rachel." Rachel did not push for an explanation. She asked no more questions. She simply pulled out her phone and sent a quick text to Marcus, their driver. The car would be waiting in 3 minutes. Caroline turned and headed for the exit. The ballroom seemed to go on for miles. Each step felt like walking through deep water. She was moving through thick mud, through the shattered remains of the life she thought she had. To reach the exit, she had to pass by Preston. He was still with Vivian. He was still smiling, still touching her. His hand had now moved to the small of her back. It was a gesture of ownership, the same way he used to touch Caroline, before she had become invisible to him. Caroline walked so close to them that she could smell his cologne. She was close enough to see a tiny stain of red wine on his collar. She was close enough to overhear Vivian say, "Preston, you're just too much." He never even glanced up. He never saw his pregnant wife passing just 3 feet away from him. He did not see her at all. "My God, I have been so blind," Caroline thought to herself. All the signs had been there for months. The late nights at the office, the new password on his phone, the way he no longer reached for her in their bed. "I saw all of it, and I chose to see nothing." She finally reached the massive doors. A uniformed doorman pulled one open for her with a slight bow. The cold November air hit her skin. It felt like being jolted awake from a long, terrible nightmare. At the threshold, she paused and turned back. She took one last look at the glittering ballroom, at the crystal chandeliers, at the silk-draped tables, and at her husband, whispering secrets to another woman. Preston laughed again. It was his real laugh, the one Caroline had once believed was meant only for her. It was the laugh she now realized had never truly belonged to her at all. The heavy door swung closed behind her without a sound. Marcus was already standing by the town car. He opened the back door for her. His face was a mask of professional courtesy, but she could see the kindness in his eyes. "Where to, Mrs. Ashworth?" Carolyn paused for a moment. She could go home, back to the enormous penthouse on Central Park West. She could go back to the bedroom she shared with a man who no longer saw her. She could go back to the nursery she had so carefully painted by herself. Because Preston was always too busy. No, not tonight. Not ever again. "To my mother's house," she said, her voice clear and steady. Marcus blinked, clearly surprised. "Ma'am, that is a 3-hour drive upstate. I am aware." She slid into the back of the car. The leather seat felt cold on her skin. She pulled the heavy door shut herself. Marcus returned to the driver's seat and did not say another word. The car pulled smoothly away from the curb in front of the Metropolitan Club. In the rearview mirror, the bright lights of the party grew smaller and smaller. The music from the string quartet vanished completely. The champagne, the laughter, and all the lies dissolved into the darkness of the night. Caroline placed both hands on her belly. The baby was still now, quiet, as if it were waiting. "I am so sorry," she whispered to her unborn child, her hand resting on her stomach. "I truly am sorry that you have to experience this." But Caroline Ashworth was not turning around. She would not go home and cry until she fell asleep, only to wake up and act like everything was normal. She was finished with the fake smiles and polite waves that came with being the perfect Ashworth wife. She was going to battle. The highway stretched before her, dark and deserted. Carolyn watched out the window as the city lights disappeared behind them. New York slowly transformed into suburbs. The suburbs faded into the countryside, and the countryside rolled into the gentle hills of upstate. Her phone buzzed, and Preston's name flashed across the screen. The phone buzzed, but she let it go. It buzzed a second time, and then a third. In the rearview mirror, she could see Marcus, the driver, watching her, but he remained silent. A good driver understands when to be invisible. The buzzing finally quit, and a voicemail symbol appeared, followed by a new text message. It was from Preston. It read, "Where are you? Your mother said you left early." Caroline just looked at the words, her fingers hovering above the glass screen. She typed out a response, then deleted it. She tried again and deleted that one too. What could she possibly say? How could she put into words, "I saw you with her. I saw your hand on her stomach. I saw the way you looked at her, the same way you once looked at me." She locked the phone and decided to let him worry. The car passed the hospital, where she had her very first ultrasound. The memory was so clear, it felt like a physical blow to her stomach. Preston had been right next to her, squeezing her hand. He had actually shed tears when the doctor let them listen to the baby's heartbeat for the first time. "We are going to be a family," he had sworn, his voice filled with emotion. "A real family, not the kind that I grew up with." That was only 5 months ago. That was before he began working late every single night, before he started password protecting his phone, and before Vivian Marlowe started working at Ashworth Industries. Caroline had searched for her online, 29 years old, with a business degree from Stanford. The woman had no profiles on social media and absolutely no digital history, as if she had been wiped clean from the internet. Back then, Caroline had just thought it was odd that perhaps the woman valued her privacy. But now, she saw the real reason. You do not leave behind a digital trail when you are involved with a married man. You do not leave any clues when you are part of his secret life. His hand on the woman's stomach was an unmistakable claim, a sign of a private world they shared, a sign of a future they planned together. Oh my goodness, she is pregnant too. The realization crashed into Caroline like a massive wave. A cold feeling washed over her, and her hands started to shake. The baby inside her began to kick, sensing its mother's sudden surge of panic. Marcus, the driver, spoke in a quiet, gentle voice. "Ma'am, would you like me to pull over?" "No." The word came out of her mouth, tight and strained. "Just keep going." She forced herself to take a slow, deep breath, in through her nose and out through her mouth, exactly as her birthing class instructor had shown her. She had attended that class all by herself because Preston had insisted he had a meeting at work. Another message popped up on her phone. It was Preston again. "Are you all right? You should have told me if you were not feeling well." The audacity of that man. The absolute audacity. He had ignored her for the entire evening, had not asked her for a single dance, and had not even bothered to introduce her to the new donors. He had failed to do any of the things a husband should do, and now he was pretending to be concerned. She thought about all the nights she had laid in bed, completely awake, just waiting for him to come home. She would listen for his key turning in the lock, and notice the faint smell of another woman's perfume on his clothes. She told herself again and again that it was nothing. She convinced herself that she was just being overly suspicious. She told herself that pregnant women are often hormonal and emotional, and that she should just feel grateful for the comfortable life he had provided her. And then there was the prenuptial agreement. She had discovered it 3 weeks ago, hidden inside a locked drawer in his home office. He had said that he lost the key, but Preston was not the kind of man who ever lost anything. He simply did not want her to know what was in there. She had picked the lock, a skill her own mother had taught her during her wild teenage years, a skill she never thought she would need to use. The document was 47 pages long, filled with confusing legal language, sections, and requirements. But one section stood out to her. It was Article 12, the section about infidelity. It clearly said that if either one of them was proven to be unfaithful, the wronged person would get 60% of all the money they had accumulated during the marriage, which would cancel out all other financial arrangements. The agreement explained everything in precise detail. Preston had told her the prenup was just a normal part of the process. He had called it a simple formality. He had said his lawyers required him to do it, and that it would never matter because he would never, ever cheat on her. And she had taken him at his word. She had signed the documents without even looking them over. She had placed all her faith in the man who whispered beautiful promises to her and put a 5-carat diamond ring on her finger. I was so naive, so hungry for affection, that I ignored every single red flag telling me to run away. Caroline then opened a folder on her phone. She had labeled it Insurance. Stored in that folder were all the pieces of evidence she had been quietly collecting for months. There were screenshots of suspicious charges on his credit card bills. There were photos of receipts from fancy restaurants she had never visited. There were booking confirmations for hotel rooms in the same city where they lived. For the last 3 months, she had not been wasting time crying. She had been preparing her case. Immediately after she found the prenup, she had called Theodore Callahan, known as Teddy, her godfather. He was the attorney who handled her father's estate and had also prepared Preston's trust fund documents long before Caroline even knew him. She had asked him some general questions about prenuptial agreements, about cheating clauses, and what could happen if a wife learned that her billionaire husband was having an affair. Teddy's replies to her what-if scenarios had been very, very specific. Another text from Preston lit up the screen. "I am starting to get worried. Please call me." This time she finally typed a message and hit send. "I am fine, just feeling tired. I went to get some fresh air." It was not a total lie, but it certainly was not the whole truth. It was a message designed to keep him off balance. His response came instantly. "Come back. We have to present the foundation check together." Of course, it was always about the public appearance. They needed to be seen as the perfect happy couple, donating $5 million to children's hospitals. Meanwhile, one of them was secretly funneling money from that exact same charity. Because that was the other secret Caroline had found. It was the secret that made his affair seem like a minor issue. The Ashworth Foundation was not just a way for Preston to look good in public. It was a front for washing dirty money. Donations would be received, but only a very small amount ever made it to any actual charities. The rest of the money would just disappear into hidden bank accounts in the Cayman Islands. Teddy had helped her understand the complex financial records. Rachel had helped her verify the questionable money movements. Her mother, Margaret Brennan, who was a retired forensic accountant, had helped her trace where the money was going. They had all been looking out for her, all waiting for the perfect time to act, all protecting her in ways she was just beginning to comprehend. "I have already left," she texted him back. "I am sorry. I was not feeling well." Then she shut her phone off completely. She saw the screen go dark and felt the link to her old life sever for good. The car continued on through a small, peaceful town. They went past a gas station, a diner with a glowing neon sign, and a church with a tall white steeple that shone in the darkness. These were ordinary places filled with ordinary people, people who had no clue that Caroline Ashworth's entire existence had just shattered. Or perhaps it had just truly started. The proof she had against Preston Ashworth was not just enough to guarantee a win in a divorce. It was enough to destroy him entirely. It would cost him his company, his reputation, and his freedom. The case against Preston Ashworth would do more than just end a marriage. It would demolish an entire dynasty. Carolyn leaned her head against the cool window. The baby inside her grew still. Her trembling stopped. But she did not cry. She had already wasted far too many tears on this man. She had devoted too much of herself to a person who only saw her as a beautiful object, a woman to carry on his family name, a useful piece of his legacy. That part of her life was finished. There were just 2 more hours until she arrived at her mother's house. 2 more hours to go over the final details of the plan for Preston Ashworth's complete and total ruin. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to prepare herself for what was coming. The porch light was on. It was always on when Margaret Brennan knew her daughter was coming home. The farmhouse appeared exactly as Caroline remembered, with its white exterior and dark green shutters. The same wind chimes her father had put up 30 years ago were still hanging there. The soft music of wind chimes drifted on the cool November air. This felt like a real home, not the cold, sterile penthouse filled with designer furniture and vast, empty spaces. Marcus guided the car up the gravel path. The tires crunched to a halt before the engine fell silent. In the quiet, he asked, "Do you need me to wait for you, ma'am?" "No, thank you, Marcus. I will call when I need a ride back," she replied. She thought to herself, "If I ever decide to go back," but kept that part a secret. Before she could even reach the porch, the front door creaked open. Her mother, Margaret, stood there, a 60-year-old woman with her silver hair pulled into a simple braid. She wore a warm flannel robe over her simple cotton pajamas. A pair of reading glasses was perched on top of her head. "You took your sweet time getting here," Maggie said. It was not a question or a hello, but a plain and simple fact. Caroline carefully climbed the porch steps. Her ankles were painfully swollen, and a dull ache spread across her lower back. The baby had dropped lower this past week, making every movement a struggle. As soon as she reached her mother, the tears she had held back all night finally broke free. She had choked them down at the charity gala, during the long car ride, and through all the months of pretending her life was perfect. Maggie wrapped her arms around her, holding her tightly. She said nothing at all as her daughter sobbed into her shoulder. The wind chimes sang a gentle tune, and a distant owl hooted from a large oak tree. The night air felt like a warm blanket wrapping around them. "Let us go inside," Maggie finally said. "I will put on some tea." The kitchen was wonderfully warm. An old wood stove crackled happily in the corner. Copper pots, the very same ones her grandmother had used, dangled from a rack on the ceiling. They were the pots her mother had used to teach her how to cook. Maggie moved with familiar grace. She filled the kettle, scooped chamomile tea from a tin, and grabbed a bear-shaped jar of honey. She took out 2 old blue cups from the cabinet, the ones with tiny chips on the rims that they could never bear to throw away. Caroline sank into a chair at the old kitchen table. This was the same table where she had struggled with homework, eaten breakfast every day, and confessed stories of her first kiss, her first heartbreak, and eventually her engagement to Preston Ashworth. Maggie had never been thrilled about the engagement. She had asked pointed questions that Caroline had brushed aside back then. "How much do you truly know about him? Have you ever met his family? What does your gut tell you about this?" Caroline's gut had been screaming at her to run for the hills, but she had stubbornly ignored it. She was too much in love, too dazzled by the attention of a handsome, rich billionaire. He had a way of making her feel like the most special person in the world. "I should have listened," she thought to herself. She should have listened to her mother, to her own instincts, to the tiny voice inside that knew something was wrong from the very beginning. The kettle started to whistle, and Maggie poured the steaming water over the tea leaves. They sat in a comfortable silence for 4 minutes while it steeped. The only sounds were the steady ticking of the wall clock and the gentle crackle of the fire. The tea slowly deepened in color. Maggie slid one of the warm cups across the table toward Caroline. She cupped her hands around it, letting the heat seep into her chilled fingers. "Mom," she started, her voice hoarse from crying. "There's something I have to tell you." "I already know, sweetheart." Caroline looked up, her expression filled with confusion. "You know what?" Maggie bent down and pulled up a thick folder from beside her chair. It was stuffed with so many papers they were spilling out. She dropped it on the table between them with a heavy thud. "I did not spend 32 years as a forensic accountant just to miss the signs of financial fraud. Your husband has been cooking the books at his company since long before you two ever met." Caroline could only stare at the folder, completely stunned. "You knew? You knew this whole time?" "I had my suspicions," Maggie corrected her gently. "So I started looking into it, and then I found the proof." Maggie flipped open the folder, revealing spreadsheets, bank statements, and official company records. "The Ashworth Foundation has funneled $14 million. It dio into secret offshore accounts in just the last 3 years. And that fancy charity event you just came from, 70% of tonight's donations will be sitting in a shell company in the Grand Cayman Islands by this time next week." The numbers on the pages swam before Caroline's eyes. She had discovered some of the fraud on her own, piecing together fragments of the truth. But seeing her mother's detailed, undeniable evidence made it all feel terrifyingly real in a way her own suspicions never had. "Why did you not say anything to me?" she asked in a small voice. "Because you had to see it for yourself," Maggie replied, her voice soft but firm. "If I had told you, you never would have believed me. You would have just defended him. You would have told me I was wrong, just another overprotective mother." Caroline remained silent because she knew her mother was right. She would have defended Preston. She had defended him to friends who asked why he was so distant. She had defended him to colleagues who heard ugly rumors. She had even defended him to her own reflection in the mirror. Maggie then said, "And there is something else." She turned to a different section of the folder. This one was full of photographs. A woman getting into a sleek car, a man holding a door for her, a small boy playing in a park. Vivian Marlowe is not just his mistress. It felt like Caroline's entire world came to a sudden screeching halt. "What are you talking about?" He has been paying her bills for 3 years. He started 2 years before he even laid eyes on you. And she has a son who is 2 years old. Maggie paused, letting the crushing weight of the words sink in. A son? Preston visits him every other weekend. Those are the weekends he tells you he is out playing golf. The room started to spin violently. The teacup slipped from Caroline's trembling hands. Hot tea spilled across the wooden table, but she barely noticed the burn. A child. Preston already had a child. He had a completely separate family. He had a secret life that he lived right alongside the one he had built with her. No. The word was a desperate, automatic reflex. No, that cannot be true. He would never do that. We have DNA proof, Maggie said, her voice calm and professional, the same one she used when presenting evidence in a courtroom. I hired a private investigator 6 months ago. He managed to get samples and had them tested. The little boy is Preston's son. A wave of nausea washed over Caroline. She wrapped her arms around her stomach as if to shield the baby inside her. The baby she thought would be Preston's first child, his heir, his chance to build a real family. But this baby was his second child, at least his second. She wondered how many other children were out there. How many other secret families did Preston Ashworth have scattered across the country? The boy's name is William, Maggie continued softly. He turned 2 years old last September. Preston bought him a miniature electric car for his birthday. He spent the entire day at Vivian's apartment putting it together for him. September. Carolyn had been 6 months pregnant in September. Preston had told her he was at a business conference in Chicago, and she had believed him without a second thought. She had always believed him. The hardest part is admitting that some little part of me knew all along. A piece of me always suspected something. Caroline finally asked, "What do I do now?" Her own voice sounded hollow and distant, like it belonged to someone else. "Well, that depends entirely on what you want." "Honor." Maggie closed the folder with a decisive snap. "You have a choice. You can go back to him, pretend you know nothing, have your baby, and continue being Mrs. Preston Ashworth. At least, until he decides to replace you with someone younger. Or, Caroline prompted, or you can stand up for yourself and fight. You can use every single piece of paper in this folder, and everything you know, to bring him to his knees. You can take his money, his company, and his freedom." Caroline looked at her mother, the woman who had raised her alone after her father died, the woman who worked 70-hour weeks to send her to a good school, the woman who had taught her how to pick a lock and how to read a balance sheet. And she was the woman who taught her to never, ever trust a man who was not willing to show you his tax returns. "There is one more thing," Caroline said. "I found something you might not know about. It has to do with the family trust." A slow smile spread across Maggie's face. "You found that too?" "Your lawyer, Teddy, called me 3 weeks ago, right after you started asking him all those what-if questions. The morality clause. It is buried deep in the family trust. Any heir to the Ashworth fortune who brings scandal upon the family forfeits their entire inheritance. Preston's father added it 20 years ago to control his son's wild behavior in college. Preston has no idea it even exists. No, Dominic never actually told him about it. He thought the threat alone would be enough to keep him in line." Maggie simply shook her head in disbelief. He truly underestimated the foolishness of his own son. Caroline's baby was not Preston's first child. It was not even his second. And by the time the son came up, Preston Ashworth was not just going to lose his wife. He was about to lose absolutely everything. The old grandfather clock in the hall chimed 3 times. Caroline had been awake for 21 hours straight. Her body was screaming for sleep, but her mind was racing. The kitchen table had been transformed into a wartime command center, completely covered with towering stacks of documents. The only light in the dark room came from the laptop screens. A battlefield of empty coffee cups covered the table. Rachel arrived at 2 in the morning, having fled a charity gala with the excuse of a headache. She had driven straight upstate with her computer and a secret she had kept for 6 months. I was looking into Ashworth Industries for a story. Han in isam tiao. Yahahi, Rachel admitted, her voice thick with regret. For half a year. I was going to tell you, Carrie. I needed to have all the evidence first. Caroline's response was hollow and distant. Everyone was trying to shield me. Everyone except for the man I married. Rachel placed her own collection of files on the table. They included financial statements, printed emails, and summaries from interviews. She had tracked down former employees who were paid to sign agreements to remain silent. The dishonesty goes much deeper than the foundation, Rachel said. For years, Ashworth Industries has been losing investors' money. Preston took over from his father 5 years ago. In that time, the company has funneled away at least $23 million. A huge portion of that cash landed in his private bank accounts. Some was sent to Vivian, and the rest was used to cover up older crimes. Carolyn stared at the documents. She saw unfamiliar names and figures that made her head spin. It was a complicated network of shell companies and offshore accounts that covered 3 separate continents. How did no one ever discover this? She asked. Oh, people did, Rachel answered. She indicated a list of names. These were all workers who began asking questions. Every single one of them was let go within 6 months. Many were pressured into signing secrecy papers for a payout. A couple of them even attempted to go to the police. But their formal reports simply disappeared. Disappeared? How is that possible? The Ashworths have very influential friends. Dominic was a major contributor to 3 different attorneys general. Preston was just following the family playbook, Rachel said with a serious expression. When you have that kind of money, you can make any trouble vanish. I was owed more than this. I was owed the truth. A single clear thought began to form in Caroline's mind. She clung to it like a lifeline in the middle of her shock and betrayal. Maggie returned from her study holding another stack of papers. I found the custody filings. What custody filings? Caroline questioned. Maggie's face was like stone. The ones Preston's attorneys were drafting. He intended to divorce you as soon as the baby was born. He was preparing to sue for sole custody. His strategy was to argue that you were emotionally unstable. A deep silence filled the room. Even Rachel, who had just detailed millions of dollars in corporate fraud, appeared shocked. He was going to steal my baby from me, Caroline whispered, unable to believe it. He was absolutely going to try, Maggie confirmed. She pushed the legal documents toward Caroline. His lawyers were gathering ammunition to use against you. Your anxiety during the pregnancy, the time you phoned the doctor, afraid the baby had stopped moving, the prescription for sleeping medication you got 3 months ago. Caroline remembered that prescription. She had been suffering from awful nightmares. She would wake up at 4 in the morning, her heart pounding. Preston had recommended she see someone. He even suggested a psychiatrist who was one of his friends. That doctor was likely reporting every single detail straight to Preston's legal team. It was all a trap, she said softly, from the very beginning. He never wanted a real family with me. He just wanted an heir with a respectable background. Someone who would look good in pictures, Rachel added, and someone without the resources to challenge him. Your mother is comfortable, but she does not have the kind of wealth the Ashworths do. Preston probably assumed you would take whatever small amount he offered, and then he expected you to vanish quietly. He assumed wrong, Caroline declared. She picked up her phone, navigated to her insurance folder, and began to review months of files. I have recordings of him lying about where he was. I have credit card statements for hotel rooms and expensive jewelry he never gave to me. I have photos of him with Vivian at restaurants where he said he was in business meetings. She looked at her mother and her best friend. They were the 2 women who had faith in her. even when she had lost faith in herself. With what the three of us have, we have enough information to ruin him. The only thing to decide is how completely we do it. The clock on the wall read 3:30. The embers in the wood stove were glowing faintly. Outside, the first hint of daylight appeared on the horizon. Caroline's phone began to vibrate. She had powered it on about an hour before. A constant stream of alerts flooded the screen. There were 16 missed calls from Preston, 12 voicemails, and 27 text messages. The messages shifted from concerned to angry and then to openly threatening. "Play the voicemails on speaker," Rachel instructed. "We should document his state of mind." Caroline activated the speakerphone. The first message started. "Caroline, where are you? Your mother told me you left without a word. Please call me." His voice sounded ordinary, perhaps slightly irritated, but he was composed. The second message began. "I do not appreciate being embarrassed like this. The foundation event was extremely important. People took notice that you were gone." The frustration was beginning to surface, but he was still protecting his public image. By the fifth message, his tone was different. "This is absurd. You are having an overreaction again. Whatever you believe you saw, you are incorrect." He was being condescending, using the same belittling voice he always used when she challenged him. The eighth message was more menacing. "If you do not call me back very soon, I will be forced to think you are having another one of your episodes. Remember what Dr. Reynolds told you about controlling your anxiety." He was manipulating her, laying the groundwork for his false story about her instability. The 12th and final message played. "I'm contacting Dr. Pennington. It is obvious the pregnancy hormones are clouding your judgment. You need to return home immediately." He was in full control mode, attempting to use her own doctor as a weapon against her. Rachel was recording the entire thing with her phone. He is already preparing his case. If this ever reaches a courtroom, he will claim she was unstable from the start. In that case, we will ensure this never sees a courtroom. Maggie's voice was like ice. We will ensure he has nothing left to fight with. Caroline looked down at her phone. She looked at the image of the man she married, the father of her unborn baby, the monster who had slept next to her for 4 years. "Call Teddy," she said firmly. "Tell him the time has come." The phone call was brief. Theodore Callahan picked up on the very first ring, despite the late hour. It seemed as if he had been anticipating her call. "I was expecting this," he said. "Your prenuptial agreement has an infidelity section. With the proof you have, you can claim 60% of all assets gained during the marriage." "What is the situation with the trust?" Caroline asked. "The morality clause is ironclad. Dominic was firm about it. Any confirmed scandal means the heir forfeits everything. The entire inheritance disappears. The family money, the company shares, every property. It is all transferred to a charity." "Does Preston know this?" she asked. "He has no idea," the lawyer replied. "His father kept it from him. He believed the mere threat of it would be enough to keep his son in line." Caroline looked at the documents, spread across her table. It was proof of his affairs, and evidence of his financial corruption. It was a blueprint of a life constructed on total lies. "I have one final question, Teddy," Caroline said. "What becomes of the Ashworth Foundation after the fraud is exposed?" "The legitimate money will be frozen while they investigate," he responded. "Anything remaining would likely be distributed to actual charities." Teddy paused for a second. "Alternatively," he went on, "it could be placed under new management. Someone could guarantee the money is used to actually help people." He looked at her pointedly. "Someone like you, if that would interest you. You were a victim in this, which gives you a legal standing, and your background in running nonprofits makes you the ideal candidate for the position." Before she knew Preston, Caroline had a career she cherished at a children's literacy charity. He had persuaded her to quit. He told her she would never need to work again and that he would take care of everything. She understood now that it was just another method of controlling her, a behavior she had once mistaken for affection. "Draft the paperwork," she ordered. "All of it. The divorce filings, the official complaint to the government, and the notice for the family trust. I want everything prepared by morning." "Consider it done," he assured her. She hung up the phone. The only noise in the kitchen was the rhythmic tick of the clock and the crackle of the fire. By sunrise, Caroline was not just leaving Preston. Her goal was to completely erase him from the Ashworth family history. The dark sky slowly turned to a soft gray, touched by a hint of pink. A new day was beginning. The hardest night of her entire life was finally coming to an end. Her phone vibrated, and the name Preston appeared on the screen. She had been waiting for this call for hours, both dreading it and needing it to happen. "You should probably answer that," Rachel said gently. "We have to know what his next move is." Caroline took a steadying breath, gathered her composure, and accepted the call. "Where on earth are you?" Preston's voice was cold and demanding. It was the same tone he used on employees who disappointed him, and now he was using it on her. "I am somewhere safe," Caroline replied, her voice even. "That is not what I asked. My mother is humiliated. You just disappeared without telling a single person. Now everyone is talking." "Then let them talk," she said. A long silence followed. She could practically hear the gears turning in his head as he tried to plan his next move. "Caroline," he said, his voice dropping to a low, threatening tone, "you need to come home right now." "No? What did you just say to me?" That single simple word felt like it stopped the world. Caroline had never really told Preston no before. She had debated with him. She had negotiated. But she had never simply refused him. "I said no, Preston. For the first time in our marriage, I am telling you no, and I am not coming back." She heard a sudden loud crash from his end of the line, like a glass being thrown against a wall. Preston always had a violent temper. He hid it well from the public, but in private, things were often broken. "Do you honestly believe you can just walk away from me?" He laughed, but it was a cruel, ugly sound. "You are leaving with absolutely nothing. Did you forget the prenuptial agreement you signed? You will get zero. You and our new baby will be out on the street." "I remember the agreement, Preston. I remember every single word. I also remember the part about infidelity. The part you said was not important because you would never cheat." The line went completely quiet. "I also remember the morality clause in your family's trust, the one your father added. The clause you do not even know is there." This time, the silence on the phone lasted even longer. She could imagine him standing there, frozen in panic, desperately trying to figure out just how much she knew. "By the way," Caroline added, her voice perfectly calm, "how is your other little boy? He should be almost 3 years old by now. William Wright, the son you visit every other weekend when you lie and say you are playing golf." The call ended without another word. Caroline stared down at her phone. Her hands were shaking, and her heart was pounding in her chest, but she could not stop a small smile from spreading across her face. She had made her move. Preston had until sunrise to surrender. She knew he never would. The next 2 hours were a blur of focused activity. Teddy emailed over the legal papers. Rachel added the final details to her story. Maggie organized all the financial evidence. Caroline reviewed everything carefully, signing documents where she needed to and approving every single step. At 6 in the morning, she formally filed for divorce. The documents were sent electronically, instantly arriving in the email inboxes of Preston's attorney, the family's trust manager, and the federal whistleblower hotline. At 6:30, her phone started ringing. It was not Preston this time. It was his father, Dominic Ashworth, and his voice was like ice. "What in the world do you think you are doing?" he demanded. "Good morning to you as well, Dominic. I assume Preston told you about our conversation." "You are making a terrible mistake," he growled. "You have no idea who you are messing with." "Oh, I know exactly who I am messing with," she replied instantly. "I am dealing with a family whose fortune is built on a foundation of lies. A husband who had a secret second family while he pretended to be a loving spouse, and a father who cares more about his public reputation than about the truth. You are going to regret this. I will make sure of it. You will make sure of what, exactly? Are you going to sue me? Threaten me? Are you going to try and prove I am an unfit mother? Caroline's voice was strong and did not waver. I have proof of every single illegal thing your family has done. I have records from the past 10 years. I have financial records, taped conversations, and witnesses who are ready to talk. If anything happens to me or my child, all of it will be released. It will be sent to every news channel, every newspaper, and every government agency. The line was silent. Your son is not just losing a wife, Dominic. He is about to lose his fortune, his company, and his freedom. The only question left is whether you want to go down with him. She hung up before he could respond. Rachel just stared at her, her mouth open in shock. I have never seen you like this before. I have never been this angry before, Caroline confessed, slumping into a chair at the kitchen table. A sudden feeling of deep tiredness washed over her. She realized just how long she had been awake. Or maybe I have been angry, she said in a quiet voice. Maybe this anger has been building inside me for years, and I just chose to ignore it. Maggie set a fresh cup of coffee down in front of her and gently squeezed her shoulder. That anger is a good thing, Maggie said softly. It means you are finally fighting for yourself. But as her mother said the words, Caroline felt the anger begin to shift into something else. The rage was only on the surface. Underneath it was a profound sadness for everything she had lost, for the life she thought she would have. After everything he had done, a part of her had truly loved Preston. She had ignored countless red flags and pushed aside her worries late at night. She had loved the man she thought he was, the part he played so convincingly. But that man never really existed. She was mourning a ghost. At 7 a.m, a large black car pulled up in front of Maggie's house. Caroline saw it through the window. 3 men wearing expensive suits got out. They were the kind of suits Preston's lawyers always wore when they were trying to intimidate someone. They walked up to the front door and knocked. They were polished and confident, clearly expecting to deal with an emotional wife who was causing a scene. They had no idea what was actually waiting inside for them. Caroline opened the door herself. She was 8 months pregnant, wearing an old sweatshirt and a pair of jeans she had borrowed. Her hair was a mess, and her eyes were swollen from a lack of sleep. Despite her appearance, she had never felt more powerful. Mrs. Ashworth, the lead lawyer said, his voice cold and professional, your husband has requested that you return home immediately. He is prepared to forgive you for this little outburst. Forgive me? Caroline almost laughed. I do not need his forgiveness. He also wanted us to inform you, the lawyer went on, that if you pursue legal action, he will prove in court that you are an unfit mother. He will cite pregnancy hormones and your recent erratic behavior. He has witnesses who will testify that you left a party for no logical reason, the lawyer added. They will all say you have been emotionally unstable. In that case, Caroline answered, you should tell him that I have a forensic accountant, an investigative reporter, and the same lawyer who drafted his family's trust agreement. He might also want to know that I have already filed the paperwork. The lawyer just blinked, looking confused. Filed what? Everything, Caroline said, offering a slight smile. The divorce papers, which include clear proof of his affair, a formal complaint about his charity fraud, and a very detailed email to his father outlining the morality clause. The lawyers glanced at each other. A silent look of uncertainty and perhaps a little bit of fear passed between them. Mr. Ashworth is prepared to negotiate a settlement, the main lawyer said, choosing his words very carefully. There is nothing to negotiate, Caroline replied. The game is over, and I have already won. She then closed the door directly in their faces. From the window, she watched them scramble back to their car. They were making frantic phone calls, waving their hands around in agitation. But the car did not leave. They were waiting for new instructions. Preston's deadline to give in was sunrise. The sun was now up. The real fight was only just beginning. The lawyers came back to her door 3 more times. Each time, their settlement offer was larger than the last, climbing to $20 million. Then it went to $30 million, and finally $50 million for her to drop the entire case. Caroline rejected every single offer. You know, you could just take the money, Rachel pointed out. They had moved to the living room, since the kitchen table was now covered in stacks of documents. $50 million would let you start a new life anywhere in the world. This was never about getting money, Caroline said, her eyes on the black car and the desperate lawyers outside. This is about doing the right thing. Doing the right thing can take a heavy toll, Maggie warned. It can wear you down completely, and sometimes you still do not win in the end. Then I will wear myself down trying, Caroline answered firmly. The morning news program began, and Rachel turned up the volume. A financial reporter was discussing unusual activities surrounding the Ashworth Industries stock. Sources inside the company report that the stock has been incredibly volatile today, the journalist announced. There are rumors of a federal investigation, but the company is refusing to make a statement. It was starting. The first cracks were appearing in the foundation of the family's empire. At 9:30, Bennett cross-called. He was the company's chief financial officer. Caroline had met him at numerous company parties. He was a nervous, quiet man who always seemed to be looking over his shoulder. "Caroline?" he began. His voice was hushed and full of panic. "We need to talk," he said. "Where did you get this number?" she asked, her voice filled with surprise. "I have had it for a couple of years, ever since that company holiday party." He paused for a moment. "I tried to warn you that night. I wanted to tell you about the money, about what Preston was doing, but you did not get it." The memory of that night suddenly came back to her. She remembered Bennett, trying to speak with her, his words fumbling. Back then, she had thought he was just awkward. "Well, I get it now," she told him. "I have proof," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I copied everything Preston thought he deleted, every hidden account. I have kept them safe for 3 years." His voice cracked on that final word. "I remained at the company because I thought I could improve things from within to protect the employees who were completely in the dark. But everything just got worse. Why are you choosing to tell me this now?" "Because you are the only person with a real shot at stopping him," Bennett said, taking a long breath. "And because you were always decent to me at those work events. Everyone else treated me like I was invisible, but you always asked about my family. You even remembered my daughter's name." Caroline had no memory of these small gestures of kindness, these brief moments of connection, while she was performing the role of Mrs. Preston Ashworth. "I will testify, Martin das Tita," Bennett declared. "Whatever you require, I will tell them the entire story." "Thank you, Bennett. Thank you for being brave enough to fight." "Someone had to," he answered. As soon as she hung up, she noticed Rachel was already taking notes. "Having the chief financial officer as a witness changes the entire game," Rachel stated. "This is testimony from someone on the inside. It gives us access to documents we never would have found. He is also a man who is putting his whole career on the line to do the right thing." Caroline felt a shift deep inside her. "He spent years trying to save the company, just as I spent years trying to save my marriage. We were both stuck in the same trap, built by the same man." When the doorbell rang, Caroline's body instantly tensed up. She was expecting more lawyers with more offers, trying to purchase her silence, but the person standing on her doorstep was not a lawyer. It was Eleanor Ashworth. Preston's mother stood there, looking completely flawless. She had on a designer coat, a Chanel handbag, and her signature pearls. She was the perfect image of a high society woman. Maggie stepped forward to block Caroline. "I do not believe you are welcome here. I am not here to cause any problems." Eleanor's voice was different. It was quieter and more human than Caroline had ever known it to be. "I am here to help." Caroline stepped around her mother. "Why on earth would you want to help me?" For a brief second, Eleanor's perfect mask seemed to slip. It was just long enough to see the profound exhaustion she had been concealing. Because my grandchild deserves a better life than Preston can offer. Because for 40 years, I have been cleaning up the messes made by the Ashworth men, and I am done. Because I know all their secrets, and it is time for the world to know them too. She presented a small silver flash drive that felt heavy with confidential information, bank statements, offshore funds, secret deals, everything Dominic has kept buried for decades. Eleanor's hand was shaking just a little. I married into this family when I was just 22 years old. I have been a part of their world ever since. Maybe this is how I can start to make amends. Caroline took the small flash drive. Why are you doing this now? Why did you not do this years ago? Because years ago, I was terrified of Dominic. I was afraid of losing my position in society, of becoming irrelevant. Tears started to form in Eleanor's eyes. But my grandson will be here soon, and I refuse to let him be raised in the same toxic world that destroyed my own son. It was the most honest thing Caroline had ever heard Eleanor say. I cannot forgive you, Caroline told her directly. Not for all the years you knew what was going on, and for every single time you told me to just smile and play along. I am not asking for your forgiveness. I am asking for a chance to do one thing right. Eleanor pulled her shoulders back. Whatever you need, whatever it takes to bring that family down, I will help you, even if it leads to my own destruction. The doorbell had been quiet for a while. The lawyer's car was gone. The morning air felt calm, with only the sound of birds singing. Caroline glanced down at the flash drive in her hand, then up at her mother-in-law's weary face, and she thought about the life she was preparing to dismantle. There would be no backing down, no deals, and no retreat. Come inside, she said. We have a lot of work to do. They worked side by side until noon. Then Eleanor departed. Rachel departed, and even Maggie went to her own office to review the new information. Carolyn was finally alone. She walked upstairs to her childhood bedroom. The pink wallpaper she had picked out at age 12 still covered the walls. The quilt her grandmother had stitched by hand still lay on the bed. The window still offered the same view of the fields she had stared at as a girl, dreaming of a different future. She had escaped from here, all the way to a penthouse apartment with a view of Central Park. She had received a 5-carat diamond ring and a marriage that was built on a web of lies. The initial rush of adrenaline had disappeared, and her anger had faded away. The only thing left behind was a deep, aching sadness. Carolyn sat on the edge of the small bed. She rested her hands on her stomach and felt the gentle kick of her daughter. I loved him, she whispered into the silent room. I really, truly loved him. How could I have been so wrong? Then the crying started. These were not the delicate tears of a movie scene, but ugly, ragged sobs that shook her entire frame. Years of suppressed pain poured out of her. She wept for the wedding she believed was a fairy tale. She wept for the honeymoon in Bali, where Preston had pretended to be so attentive. She wept for the night he proposed on his yacht, beneath the stars, promising her a forever that never existed. She cried for the pregnancy test she had to look at alone because he was on another business trip. She cried for the ultrasound appointments he always missed. She cried for the nursery she decorated by herself while he was out with Vivian. Then she cried for the person she had been before she ever met him. She had been a strong, independent woman, happy with her work at a nonprofit, her small apartment, and her uncomplicated life. That woman was gone, buried under 4 years of Preston Ashworth's opinions, his social calendar, and his endless needs. At some point, I became a stranger to myself. The baby kicked once more, this time with more force, as if reacting to the stress flooding Caroline's body. She forced herself to take a slow, deep breath, trying to become calm. She had to remember that a small life depended on her to be strong. Maggie appeared quietly in the doorway. She did not speak, but just came and sat on the bed beside her, holding her daughter, while she cried, "I wasted 4 years, Mom." "You did not waste them," Maggie said, softly stroking her hair. "You survived them. There is a huge difference. I should have known the truth sooner. I should have left him so much sooner." "Maybe," Maggie said, "or maybe you had to wait until this exact moment. This moment when you finally had the strength to stand up and fight back." Maggie's voice was calm and steady. "The Caroline who married him never could have survived this. You needed to become someone else first." Caroline thought about that. She thought about the young woman who had signed a prenuptial agreement without even glancing at it. The woman who believed every lie because she desperately wanted them to be true. That woman had been weak and hungry for love. This woman was neither of those things. "I am scared," Caroline admitted in a small voice, "of what happens next, of raising a baby alone, of being remembered as the woman who took down the Ashworth dynasty." "That is a good thing. Fear shows that you understand what is at stake." Maggie moved back to look her daughter in the eyes. "But you are not going to do this alone. You have me, and you have Rachel, and you have Teddy and Bennett, and you even have Eleanor, heaven help us. What if I fail? What if you succeed?" Caroline had no answer for that. She had not let herself think about success. She had not dared to imagine a life beyond the next few difficult hours. "Go take a shower," Maggie suggested. "Put on some clean clothes and get something to eat. Then we will plan the next steps." She left the room, and Caroline sat alone for another minute. She was pulling her strength together, getting ready for the rest of the day. The shower was hot, so hot it almost stung her skin. She stood under the streaming water until her skin turned pink, until her tears were washed away, and until she felt completely clean for the first time in years. She put on clothes from her old wardrobe, a pair of jeans stretched tightly over her growing belly, and a large sweatshirt from college. She looked at herself in the mirror. She did not recognize the woman looking back at her, but perhaps that was a good thing. She had spent 4 years becoming Caroline Ashworth. It was finally time to remember the person she was before all of that started. By 3 in the afternoon, the news was absolutely everywhere. An anonymous source had leaked the documents to every major financial news outlet. The Securities and Exchange Commission quickly announced a formal investigation into Ashworth Industries. The company's stock price plunged 15% in a single hour. Board members were resigning, and the lawyers were scattering. Caroline saw the whole thing happen from the comfort of Maggie's living room. Rachel was right there with her, her phone buzzing nonstop with messages from her editor. "I did not send anything," Rachel insisted. "My plan was to wait until tomorrow. I wanted to give Preston enough time to dig his own grave even deeper. So who could have done it?" A simple text message from Teddy gave them the surprising answer. It was Eleanor. In the end, she had chosen to protect her grandchild over her own son. Carolyn could only stare at her phone in disbelief. This was her mother-in-law, the woman who had always advised her to just put on a smile and pretend everything was fine. For 40 years, she had valued appearances more than the truth. But when it mattered most, she chose family instead of the perfect image. On the television, a live broadcast showed the scene outside the Ashworth Industries headquarters. A swarm of reporters had gathered as stunned employees streamed out of the building. The entire empire was crumbling right before their very eyes. Then, a picture of Preston filled the screen. It was an old photo from a much happier time, showing him looking handsome and so charming, the ideal son from the ideal family. The news anchor's voice narrated his spectacular fall from grace. "We have reports that Preston Ashworth III may face criminal charges for charity fraud and embezzlement. His wife filed for divorce just this morning, citing infidelity and financial misconduct. His wife. For a little while longer, that was still her. Just then, her phone rang. It was Preston calling again. But this time she answered, "Carrie." His voice sounded completely different, totally broken. All the arrogance had vanished. "Please, I can explain all of this." "No, you cannot." "The company, my father. You have no idea what kind of pressure I have been under. I understand that you had a choice to make every single day, and every single day you chose to lie to me. I love you." Caroline almost laughed, but it might have been a sob. That word had absolutely no meaning coming from his mouth. It never really did. "No, Preston. You loved what I represented, the perfect wife, the perfect family portrait, the image you had to maintain for your job." Her voice remained calm and steady. "You never loved me. You do not even know who I am. I can change. We can try therapy. We can have a fresh start. It is far too late for that. It was too late the moment you laid your hand on that other woman's stomach." The other end of the line went silent. Then she heard a sound she had never heard from Preston Ashworth before. He was sobbing. "Please," he begged. "I am losing everything. You already lost me months ago. You just did not bother to notice." She ended the call. The news coverage continued, filled with more details, more video clips, and more experts analyzing the collapse of a powerful family dynasty. At 5 in the evening, the board of Ashworth Industries called an emergency meeting. At 6:30, they announced that Preston had been terminated as chief executive officer. At 7, Dominic Ashworth issued a public statement condemning his son's actions and distancing the family name from the scandal. At 8 o'clock, Teddy showed up with the papers that would officially end her marriage. "They are giving you everything," he said with a smile. The conditions were spelled out clearly. 60% of all their marital assets, exactly as their prenuptial agreement specified. Caroline would have full custody of their child, and Preston would have no visitation rights until he passed a full psychological evaluation. The New York apartment, the vacation home in Florida, and full control of the family foundation would all belong to her. Caroline went through the documents, reading every single line with care. It was everything she had asked for, everything she had been fighting to get. "Preston is also cut off from his inheritance because of the morality clause," Teddy added. The family trust made that official this afternoon. He was now essentially penniless, except for whatever money he had hidden in offshore accounts. And even those accounts were frozen as the Securities and Exchange Commission carried out its investigation. He would be lucky if he could even afford a public defender. Caroline signed the papers, her hand perfectly steady and calm. Her friend Maggie poured a bottle of wine, but they did not raise their glasses for a toast. This was not a moment for celebration. It was just an ending, the last page of a chapter being turned before a new one could begin. At 9 o'clock that night, Rachel's article went live online. It was a thorough investigation that exposed the secret family, the financial crimes, and all the manipulation, laid out in sharp, devastating detail. By midnight, Preston Ashworth's reputation was utterly destroyed. Caroline stood near the window, gazing out into the dark night. The stars were shining brightly above, and the wind chimes sang a soft melody. She had done it. She had won against incredible odds, against a billion-dollar corporate machine, and against a family that had been buying its way out of trouble for generations. She rested both hands on her belly, and her daughter responded with a gentle kick. "It is all over now," she whispered. "He is not going to hurt us anymore." But as she said the words, she knew that was not completely true. The legal battle would likely continue for months, maybe even years. There would be more meetings with lawyers, more days in court, and more custody evaluations. Preston was sure to fight back. His father would certainly pay for every appeal he could file. The powerful Ashworth machine would continue to churn on, even without its golden boy. But Caroline had something that they would never possess. She had the truth. She had people who genuinely loved her, and she was going to have a daughter who would grow up knowing her mother was not a victim. That was more than enough for her. In fact, That was everything. 1 week later, Caroline was in Dr. Pennington's office for a regular checkup. The baby was perfectly healthy, very active, and seemed eager to enter the world. "You have been through an incredible amount of stress," Dr. Pennington said with a gentle voice. "How are you holding up?" "I am doing better than I feel like I should be," Caroline replied, before pausing for a moment. "Is that strange? Should I feel more heartbroken about all this?" "There is no should when you are talking about grief. Every person processes it differently," Dr. Pennington answered, writing a note in her chart. "But if I can be frank, you look more at peace than I have seen you in months." It was completely true. The constant anxiety that had been her companion throughout her pregnancy had finally lifted. The sleepless nights, the racing thoughts, and the persistent feeling that something was terribly wrong were all gone. "I kept telling myself it was just pregnancy hormones," Caroline admitted. "All of the worry and fear. Preston always told me it was just the hormones." "You were having a perfectly normal reaction to a very abnormal set of circumstances," the doctor said. "Your body sensed that something was wrong, even if your mind was not ready to accept it." Caroline thought about all those nights she had spent wide awake, searching on Google at 3 in the morning and pretending to be asleep when Preston finally came home late. Her body had been screaming warnings at her, but she had chosen not to listen. She made a promise to herself that she would never ignore her intuition again. Later that afternoon, she made up her mind to meet with Vivian Marlowe. Everyone thought it was a horrible idea, including Maggie, Rachel, and Teddy. Even Eleanor, who had her own messy past with her son's other woman, advised her not to do it. But Carolyn felt she needed to understand. She needed to look at the woman who had been part of her husband's secret life of lies. They agreed to meet at a little coffee shop in a quiet town, a neutral location with no cameras and no one to bother them. Vivian looked older than her 29 years. She seemed exhausted and haunted. Her hands shook as she lifted her coffee cup. "I did not know," she said before Caroline had a chance to say a word. "I did not know about the fraud or his plans for you. I honestly thought—" Her voice faded. But then she started again. "I thought I was the love story. I believed you were just the business arrangement." "Is that what he told you?" Caroline asked. "He told me everything that I ever wanted to believe," Vivian said, her eyes starting to fill with tears. "He said you two did not love each other, that your marriage was only for appearances. He promised me that as soon as the baby was born, he would leave you, and we could finally become a proper family." "And what about your son, William?" The tears finally rolled down her face. "He almost never sees him. He sends money and buys him toys, but he does not come to visit. He never really has." Caroline looked at the woman sitting in front of her. She was not some evil monster or a homewrecker. She was just another soul who had been trapped in Preston's web of deceit, another woman who had believed his lies. "I am not going to forgive you," Caroline said in a calm voice. "I cannot do that. You knew that he was a married man. You made your own decisions." Vivian nodded her head, accepting her words. "I know. But I do understand that you were a victim too, just a different kind of victim." A visible change came over Vivian's face. It might have been relief, or maybe it was just hearing a truth that she had been avoiding. "What are you going to do now?" Caroline asked. "I am taking William to live with my parents in Oregon. We are going to make a fresh start," Vivian said, as she wiped her eyes. "I do not want anything from him, not his money and not his help. I just want to be free." "Then you should be free," Caroline said. There was no embrace, no exchange of phone numbers, or promises to stay connected. Some bonds are simply too painful to maintain. As Caroline drove toward her mother's home, she felt something she didn't anticipate. It wasn't forgiveness, but rather a profound sense of release. She was freeing herself from the anger she had carried for someone who was not worth the emotional weight. Her New York apartment was already being prepared for her return. Caroline had hired new decorators, true professionals, not the ones her mother-in-law Eleanor had pushed on her. She was finally selecting her own colors, her own furnishings, her own life. "Are you certain you are ready for this?" Maggie asked while they packed the car. "No, but I have to go anyway," Caroline answered, setting the final box down. "The baby will be here in 4 weeks. I have to be home." "That apartment was never your home, my dear." "I am aware of that," Caroline said, "but it's going to be. I am going to fill it with my own things, my own memories, and my own life. I'm going to make it a place that is truly mine." Maggie held her in a tight, long hug, a mother and daughter who had both weathered their own personal storms. "You call me if you need anything at all," she insisted. "I will. I am serious. Anything, even if it is 3 o'clock in the morning, and you just want to hear my voice." "I know, Mom. I love you." "I love you too. Always." The drive back into the city was a 3-hour journey. Caroline saw the green fields of the countryside slowly give way to suburbs, and finally to the massive skyscrapers of the city. It was the exact same highway she had taken just a week ago, but this time, everything felt different. She left her mother's house the same way she had arrived, in complete silence. But this quiet was not filled with dread. It was filled with peace. 3 months later, a completely changed woman answered the door of the Central Park West apartment. In her arms, she held a baby girl named Ruby Margaret Brennan. The name Ashworth was nowhere to be found. The apartment had finally become a home. The cold, stark white walls were now covered in a soft, welcoming cream paint. The sterile, modern furniture had been replaced with comfortable items she discovered in small antique shops. Family photos were displayed everywhere, capturing genuine moments instead of posed portraits for a magazine. Carolyn held Ruby close and walked over to the window. The view had not changed. Central Park was still a sprawling carpet of green below. The city continued to hum with its constant, restless energy, but her perspective on it all was completely new. She realized that the door to her prison had been open all along. She had been her own warden, and now she had finally granted herself freedom. Ruby was beginning to stir, ready for her feeding. Caroline settled into the old rocking chair her mother had sent, the very one Maggie had used to rock her to sleep as a baby. She felt a deep connection to 3 generations of women, all linked together by love. While she nursed her daughter, she reflected on the person she was before. She remembered the woman who entered that gala, 8 months pregnant, feeling utterly invisible. She remembered dropping a champagne glass and feeling her world shatter along with it. That woman had been so frightened and so desperate. She was desperately holding on to a marriage that was only a fantasy in her own head. The woman in this chair today was none of those things anymore. The doorbell rang, announcing Teddy's arrival for their weekly meeting. He brought documents for the foundation, which was now named the Brennan Family Foundation. The Ashworth name and all the deceit it represented had been permanently erased. Their first grants had been distributed the previous month. The money went to women's shelters, financial literacy programs, and support systems for mothers escaping difficult circumstances. It was providing real assistance to people who were genuinely in need. Preston's trial is set to start next month, Teddy mentioned. He always approached the topic with great care and sensitivity. The prosecutors are going to ask for your testimony. "I am aware," she said. "Are you going to do it?" Caroline gazed down at Ruby's perfect, tiny face. "Yes," she confirmed, shifting the baby in her arms. "One day she will ask me about her father. I want to tell her that I spoke the truth, that I did not run and hide, that I stood up and told everyone exactly what he did." "It is not going to be easy," Teddy cautioned. "His legal team will attempt to portray you as vengeful and unstable, just like they threatened to do before." "They can certainly try," she said calmly. "I have the proof. I have the witnesses. I have absolutely nothing to hide." Teddy broke into a smile. "You have changed, Caroline." I just remembered who I was before I met him, she answered, looking directly at him, before all of his deception. That woman was always there, he said softly. She just got a little lost for a short time. After Teddy was gone, Caroline put Ruby down in her crib for a nap. She stood by the window, watching the sun set over the park as shades of orange, pink, and gold painted the sky. Her phone vibrated. It was a message from Rachel. "You need to see the newspaper tomorrow. We won a Pulitzer." The investigative report, the very article that had dismantled the Ashworth Empire, had earned the most prestigious award in journalism. A second message came through from Bennett Cross. He was now in full cooperation with federal investigators. The new board had held a vote, and Ashworth Industries was being completely dissolved. Dominic was also facing his own set of criminal charges. The empire was in ruins, the father was falling from grace, and the son was awaiting trial. Everything Preston had cherished more than his wife, more than his own family, more than simple human kindness, had turned to ash. A final message arrived from a number she did not recognize. Caroline nearly deleted it. It was from Vivian. "Thank you for not taking me down too. I am getting professional help. William and I are trying again. You gave us that opportunity." Caroline set her phone aside. She went into the nursery and looked down at Ruby's crib, watching her baby sleep peacefully. She thought about that awful gala and how much her life had changed since that night. She pictured the champagne glass as it fell and shattered across the floor. She recalled the ballroom door closing behind her with barely a whisper. The woman who walked into that party was Preston Ashworth's pregnant wife. She was nothing more than an accessory, a beautiful object for him to display, a vessel to carry his family name. But the woman who walked out was herself once more. She was simply Caroline, a woman who refused to be overlooked, made to feel insignificant, or completely erased. The baby inside her gave a little kick. Caroline's eyes fluttered open and met her daughter's cloudy newborn gaze. "Someday, I am going to tell you a story," Caroline whispered. "It is about a woman who had forgotten who she was. A woman who let a man persuade her that she was small and silly and not worth very much at all. A woman who almost lost everything," she continued in a soft voice, as little Ruby yawned and waved her tiny fists in the air. "And I will tell you how she found her strength again, how she battled her way back to the light, how she constructed a whole new life from the burned-out ruins of her old one." Caroline reached into the bassinet and gently brushed her daughter's cheek. "That woman was your mother, and I want you to always remember that you are never too broken to be pieced back together. You are never too lost to find your way home again, and you are never too quiet to define the power of your own voice." Ruby grabbed onto her mother's finger and held it with a surprising amount of strength. "We are going to be just fine," Caroline said. "Actually, we are going to be much better than just fine. We are going to be absolutely everything." Outside the window, the city lights began to twinkle as darkness settled over the sky. It was the beginning of a brand new chapter. Caroline gently lifted her daughter and held her near, allowing a profound feeling of peace to wash over her. She had walked into that gala as one person, and she had walked out as someone completely new. And during the journey between those two versions of herself, she had recovered the one thing she thought was lost forever, her own identity. The end was not really an end. It was simply a new beginning, and she was prepared for whatever was coming next. The courtroom was filled to capacity. The media packed the viewing gallery, and news crews waited on the steps outside. People were calling it the trial of the decade. Preston Ashworth sat at the table for the defense. He looked as if he had aged 10 years in the past 12 months. His extremely expensive suit seemed far too large for his now slender body, and his well-known golden boy smile was nowhere in sight. Carolyn was seated in the witness box, appearing calm and self-assured. Her daughter, Ruby, was safe at her apartment with Maggie, who had moved into the city to help care for her granddaughter. The prosecutor gently led her through the evidence. She spoke about the financial crimes, the secret second family, and the long years of emotional games. She laid out everything she had found in those chaotic hours right after she had fled the gala. Preston's lawyers tried their hardest to dismantle her composure. They hinted that she was nothing but a bitter, vengeful woman. They insisted that her only motivation was money. But she addressed every single one of their questions with a calm and unwavering voice. There were no tears, no angry reactions, only the simple, honest facts. When it was all finished, and the jury had departed the room to reach their verdict, she walked directly past the defense table. Preston looked up at her, and his eyes appeared vacant. "Was it worth it?" he asked her. "Was destroying everything worth it to you?" She stopped for a moment and looked at the man she once had loved, the man who had shattered her heart into pieces, the man who had accidentally made her stronger than she had ever dreamed she could be. "You destroyed yourself, Preston," she said quietly. "I simply told the truth." Then she turned her back on him and walked out of the dim courtroom and into the bright, warm sunshine. She was stepping into a future that belonged only to her. The jury came back after just 4 hours, guilty on every single charge. The sentence was 23 years in a federal prison. Caroline did not celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. There was only justice, and it had finally been delivered. That night, she sat in her apartment holding Ruby. The lights of the city glittered outside her window. The wind chimes that once hung on her mother's porch were now in the nursery, playing a gentle melody with every passing breeze. She thought about everything she had lost and everything she had gained. She thought about the person she had been and the strong woman she had become. His pregnant wife walked out of that party without saying a single word, and by the next day, the billionaire's entire world had collapsed. But that was not the real story. That was not the most important part of it all. The real story is about a woman who remembered how to find her voice. It is about a woman who discovered her own strength and built a completely new life from the wreckage of lies. The real story is about survival. It is about being resilient. It is about the quiet power that emerges when you refuse to be ignored any longer. Caroline gently kissed her daughter's forehead and watched the city lights sparkle in the dark. "Once upon a time," she whispered, "there was a woman who believed she was lost. But she was never lost. She was simply waiting to be found." Ruby smiled in her sleep. Outside, the city sang its constant song, and Caroline Brennan, was finally and truly home. If this story touched your heart, if you felt Caroline's struggle and celebrated her triumph, you're not alone. So many of our listeners have drawn strength from stories just like this one. Please leave a comment below and share with me, what would you have done if you were in Caroline's shoes? I personally read each and every comment, and your story might just inspire the next one we create. And if this is your first time visiting, please press that subscribe button and activate your notifications. We publish new stories every single week. They are stories about inner strength, about survival, and about the quiet power of women who will not be silenced. Please share this video with someone who might need to hear this message today. Sometimes, all a person needs is a story to help them take that first courageous step toward their own freedom. And if this story truly moved you, please give it a like. It helps more people discover these stories when they need them the most. Closing statement. This content has been carefully researched. It was developed and manually edited by our committed team to share meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every story is produced with a specific intention. It is designed not only for entertainment, but to inspire, to validate, and to empower you, our valued audience. Thank you for being such a wonderful part of this community.